Hello, Bo at Ballard Creek, and today is Chapter 10, Sluicing and Cleanup. In June, wild roses and bluebells crowded together under birch trees lining the banks of the creek. Bluebells and roses always grew together as if they were best friends, Bo thought, and as if they knew how pretty they looked, pink and blue. The first mosquitoes were gone. The lazy, slow-moving, long-legged ones that hid all winter under the spruce bark. Now the summer mosquitoes had hatched, much smaller and more ordinary. Some years the mosquitoes weren't so bad. Not this year, though. Mosquitoes were everywhere. Bo looked, and swarms of them rose up in the air when she ran through the tall grass. Their thin, tiny, whining against the mosquito screen by Bo's bed was so loud that sometimes she had to close her ears with her fingers before she could fall asleep. Jack kept a smudge pot smoldering outside the cook shack door to keep mosquitoes out, but still they got in through the thin smoke and fell into the oatmeal and got baked into cookies. Mosquito time was cleanup time. Cleanup was when the miners found out how much gold they had in pay dirt they'd been piling up all winter. They had to shovel all that pay dirt into long wooden sluice boxes and wash it to get the gold out. The boxes were called sluice boxes because sluicing meant washing, Arvid told her. And it was called pay dirt because when all the gold was taken out, they could sell the gold and get paid. Bo nodded her head to show she understood all that. But what I don't see is where the gold comes from, she said. Better ask Peter, said Arvid. He'll explain it better than me. So when Peter was leaving the cook shack after breakfast, Bo pulled his sleeve. About the gold, she said. How did it get into the pay dirt? Well now, that's an amazing thing, Peter said, smiling. He liked to explain about rocks to Bo. Peter sat down next to her on the bench at the long table and peered earnestly into her face like he always did when she was explaining something. Millions and millions of years ago, he said, the gold in our pay dirt formed in some rocks. Happens all the time. Different rocks, different things form in them when they cool down or get squeezed, like that mica you see shining in rocks, and those little red garnets I showed you up in the schist, and that stripy rock. Bo nodded to show that she was listening hard. Now, remember I told you how rocks change? All the mountains that ever were get turned into sand someday. I remember, said Bo, but it never seems true. I know, said Peter. People just can't imagine it. Hard for me, too. He lit his pipe and puffed on it and made a little flame go up. Well, for millions of years, those rocks with gold in them were part of a mountain, and those mountains were getting worn down to boulders and rocks, and the rocks with gold in them got tumbled down the creeks and into the rivers, got all smashed and pounded into gravel and sand. So you know gold is very heavy. Heavier than water, heavier than gravel and sand, Peter said. So the gold that was in the sand and the gravel sank straight down to the bottom of the creeks and the rivers. Then, after more millions of years, the creek got buried and buried again and again. Now, the gold's deep down in the gravel and the dirt in the cracks of the bedrock, underground. It couldn't go any deeper because the bedrock is like a solid floor underground, not broken into bits like the rocks on the top of the earth. Peter leaned back and put his hands on his thighs. And that's why we dug the shaft down to the bedrock. That's where the gold ended up after all those millions of years. Bedrock's where we have to dig the pay dirt out. All winter long the boys had been underground in the cold dark. They had carbide lamps on their hats, and in their pockets were full of candles that they'd put in holders on the walls of the tunnel. But it was still dark down there. Before they could dig out any pay dirt, they had to thaw the frozen ground with steam. The steam came from a boiler through long rubber pipes to steam probes. One man would hold the probe while the other hammered it into the ground. They'd leave the probes overnight, and in the morning they would shovel the thawed ground, which had turned into boiling hot muck, and they'd put that into their wheelbarrows, and they'd push their wheelbarrows to the square bucket that was sitting in the bottom of the shaft. It was a big bucket. It could hold 3 wheelbarrow loads. Sometimes the bucket had to carry a man up to the top, like last year when Alex had taken sick down there and couldn't go up the ladder. Then the steam winch hauled the bucket up out of the shaft and took it zigzagging along the cable across the digging to the gin pole. The bucket tipped there so that the load would dump into a pile of dirt. Bo was not allowed near the diggings when the winch was working. Everyone had seen what could happen when the cable snapped. Philip had two fingers missing. The cable had whipped off. She wasn't allowed in the boiler house either. That was where Dan kept the big fire roaring and snapping under the boiler. He fed the fire with cords and cords of wood, and he had to keep the boiler filled with water, too. Bo thought Danny had the hardest job of all. When they weren't using the steam for probes, the boiler made steam for the winch and buzzsaw. Boilers were dangerous. The boys all knew stories about boilers blowing up and sending scalding steam and pieces of red-hot iron over everyone. There were lots of bad accidents in mining camps. After the snow was almost gone, the boys couldn't go underground anymore. It wasn't safe. In the winter, the ground around the shaft stayed frozen. The sides of the tunnel were frozen. But in the summer, the sides of the tunnel might begin to slough off, and sometimes there was too much bad gas underground when the weather got warm. So they stopped digging, and they started all the work that must be done before sluicing. They'd been getting ready for weeks, stacking up cords and cords of wood by the boiler house to run the steam pump and the winches and the buzzsaw. They'd repaired the sluice boxes and made new ones with boards that they sawed at the pit. The sluice boxes had to be perfectly smooth inside so that no gold would catch on splinters. Bo sat with Johnny and Carl while they played and sanded those boards. They gave her curls of yellow wood to play with. "Feel that?" Carl said, showing her the board he'd finished. "Smooth as a baby's bottom." Bo didn't know what a baby's bottom would feel like, but the board was smooth, just as the satin band on her favorite blanket. "The boards have to fit together perfectly, so there won't be any cracks for tiny bits of gold to hide in," Johnny said. So Johnny and Carl fitted and sanded and planed and fitted some more until there wasn't even a tiny space in the boards to trap flakes of gold. Then the boys put all of the sluice boxes together so that they made one long wooden trough. There's a picture of them working. One long wooden trough slanting down from a pile of pay dirt to the bank of the creek. The pump was tested and primed, and the canvas hose was checked for holes, and at last they were ready. Now they needed water to wash gold out of the pay dirt. The water in Ballard Creek was low and sluggish after a long winter, and if there was not enough water, there would be no sluicing, and there would be no gold. Not enough water was the worst thing that could happen in a mining camp. But in a few days, snow in the hills melted, and the nearly empty creek was suddenly filled with rushing icy water. It tumbled the rocks to the bottom of the creek, making a lovely clattery sound. Bo wanted to wade up the rushing creek and feel the water pull hard at her boots. When Arvid saw her starting at the creek from the cook shack window, he knew what she was thinking. He scowled fiercely at Bo. "You get back here. You stay out of that creek. No playing in that creek when it's high and fast." "I won't," Bo said in an insulted way, as if she'd never thought of such a thing. The boys quickly made a dam for the creek so that the water would fill the sluicing pond, and when they were ready to go, the pump would be sunk into the sluicing pond and a big hose would be attached to the pump. When they turned the pump on, the powerful surge of water from the hose would wash away the pay dirt down to the sluice boxes. At lunchtime, the boss said, "Tomorrow we'll start double shifts." That meant some of the men would work in the day, and when they were finished, the rest of the boys would work all night. Bo remembered the double shifts last year, when she'd had to be extra quiet all day because some of the boys in the bunkhouse were sleeping. Now that there was water for sluicing, everyone had to work very, very fast without stopping, around the clock, because you never knew when the water would dry up. Even Jack would leave the kitchen and work at sluicing. The boss couldn't waste a big, strong man like Jack in the kitchen when it was cleanup time. But Bo didn't really like it when things were so mixed up and the papas weren't where they were supposed to be. Gintu came early to cook the breakfast in Jack's place. She shook Bo awake, which she'd never done before. Bo sat up in bed and stared at Gintu. "Tell everyone Grizzly tracks down by the spring," Gintu told Bo. Bo knew why Gintu was excited. A grizzly was not something you wanted hanging around. Jack had been on the porch washing up. He came inside toweling his hair, his eyebrows raised in a question. "What's Gintu all bothered about?" Gintu made a bear tracks toe-in walk with her hands to show Jack. "Grizzly tracks," Bo said, "down by the spring." Jack said, "Good thing you're staying home today to help with sluicing." He took a rifle down from its pegs over the door to check and see that it was loaded, and then he hung it back up and said, "Probably that bear's just moving cross country, but we'll keep our eyes open." "I'm going to sleep now," Jack told her, in the bunkhouse. "I can't sleep in here worrying about what Gintu's doing." Jack stretched his huge arms about bursting his shirt sleeves. "Help Gintu all you can." He bent down and kissed the top of her head and went out the door. Jack had mixed up a batter of hot cakes the night before, so the boys had a good breakfast, though they didn't like the way Gintu fried their hot cakes. She left them on the griddle too long, so they got tough. Shoe leathers, the boys called the hot cakes that Gintu made. Bo didn't like 'em that way either, but as long as you could put syrup on 'em, you could eat 'em. There were no biscuits or bacon or sausage, but there was oatmeal. Not a breakfast that Jack would have given them, but they didn't complain. They just teased Gintu as usual and pulled Bo's braids when they left. The boys were interested in what Gintu had to say about the grizzly. No chance that any bear would come near the diggings with the noise from the pump and the boiler and all, but they warned Bo about going near the spring.